24/7. When they were enslaved in Egypt, they worked 24/7 all year long. The very idea of stopping and taking a rest is so foreign to them that maybe they couldn't do it, right?
And you got to think this was a brand new nation.
It's a brand new nation.
God says, you will take a day off.
You will take a day off.
That would have been like,
So it's a really good segue. If you go forward into Nehemiah, right? So Nehemiah is after. So they have. So the nation of Israel had been in captivity in Babylon, right? And they came back, and they're rebuilding the walls. They're rebuilding everything. And Nehemiah says, and they weren't taking a break. And Nehemiah says, okay, stop. We are going to take a break on the Sabbath day. We are going to observe Shabbat. And so they closed up the gates, and the merchants came, and they stood outside the walls. And Nehemiah stood up on the walls, and he said to them, if you come here again tomorrow, I'm going to lay hands on you, right? Meaning I'm going to come out and fight you, right? It was that important. It was that different. They were the only nation in existence that took that day off throughout history, right? Anyway, so I just found that to be something that really sticks out to me. And the people were to rest and enjoy one another and to reflect on what God had done for them. Okay, let's skip over Exodus 20 and let's go to Deuteronomy 5. Have y'all ever read the Ten Commandments reviewed in Deuteronomy? It's kind of an interesting read. It expands more. It explains more about what each of the commandments are in Deuteronomy than it does to me than it does in Exodus 20. So Deuteronomy 5, and we're going to look at verses 12 through 15. I think I just went off again. Pardon? No, we're good? Deuteronomy 5, the air conditioner went off. That's what it is. Deuteronomy 5, looking in verse 12. I love this. Observe the Sabbath day. And again, the word is Shabbat. Observe the Sabbath day to keep it holy as the Lord your God commanded you. 6 days you shall work. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work, you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your ox, nor your donkey, nor any of your cattle, nor your stranger who is within your gates, that your male servant and your female servant may rest, as well as you. And remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there by a mighty hand and by an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day, to keep Shabbat, to keep that holy celebration, to keep that rest, that reflection, and that celebration. So notice that it goes a little bit deeper. If you go back and you look in Exodus 20, it doesn't go that deep. It says the who. It's everybody, right? It's you, your wife, your son, your daughter, your grandkids, your male servant, your female servants, your dog, your cat, your ox, your donkey, everything, everybody, and the stranger who is Jew or not, right, is to rest. That way, everybody rests and everybody reflects. Everybody enjoys one another, right? So it just further defines exactly, and it further defines the what, right? The who and the what. I love this. I'm all for it. I wish that we did that today. But, as y'all know, I'm quite often I'm not here because I work on Sundays sometimes, depending upon what's going on, as do a lot of people, right? Work on Sundays. And then if I'm working on a Sunday, then I typically don't take another day off that week and just rest. Do you? Who does that? Especially in our society today. Do we do that? Actually take a day off and actually just rest? I love the idea of that, right? I wish we still did that. So what went wrong? So what went wrong with, go ahead.
There's always still things to do on the Sabbath, like milk the cow,
Mm-hmm.
And I remember as a kid, when we learned this and read it, the first time it set in my brain, Daddy had us some cows or something got out on a Sunday and whatever, and Rex and I got to cutting up today. He says, hey, it's the Sunday, the Sabbath. We're not supposed to be trying to get these cows back in the pasture today.
Well,
And so we got another little lesson on the ox and the tread out, don't muzzle the ox and all this stuff.
yeah, well, that's different.
And so there is always something that shows up, and something may happen. And Ronnie Patterson's favorite expression was, well, we had an ox in the ditch. Well, you need to get it out. He may be on the Sabbath. Sometimes things happen,
So
that you have to take care of.
that,
things just have to be taken care of. So why did Jesus have so many confrontations with the Jewish leaders of his day, right? Why did that happen? Why did he have so many and most of the time it was over the Sabbath day, right? Most of the time it was over the Sabbath day. Turn with me over to Matthew. Say, I'm sorry? Oh, yeah. Oh, we were terrible about that when our kids were young. We were horrible about that because they'd have soccer tournaments or whatever and Sunday morning, and we would be there. And I wish I could go back and change that. Matthew chapter 12 is where we're going. Matthew chapter 12, starting in verse 1. This is one of the first confrontations. Don't look at me like that, Hunter. This is one of the first confrontations that Jesus has with the Pharisees over a Sabbath day, a broach of the Sabbath day laws, right? So let's read this real quick. Verses 1 through 8. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and his disciples were hungry. Notice that it was his disciples were hungry and began to pluck heads of grain and to eat. Well, number one, let's just stop there for a second. Number one, they're in somebody's field. It's not their field. They're in somebody's field, right? And they're plucking grain. So number one, you would think, well, are they stealing grain? No, because in the law, it was written that if they were hungry, they could go through anybody's field, and you could pluck the grain, and you could thresh it in your hands. The only thing you couldn't do was use any kind of mechanical contrivance, any kind of heavy machinery to harvest somebody else's field. But you could go through and grab handfuls, and that wasn't considered stealing, right? Anyway, so they began to pluck heads of grain and to eat. And when the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath. But he said to them, let's just stop there a second. Let's stop there a second, and let's talk about, well, number one, the Greek word here is Sabbaton, Sabbaton. I really don't know how to pronounce it, but it's Sabbaton. Actually, I do too. It's Sabbaton, right? And it actually means Sabbath, is actually what that means, Sabbath, right? So it is a day of weekly repose from secular avocations. That's what Strong's Greek Concordance says. A weekly repose of secular avocations. That's what that word means there, right? Okay? Pharisees, your disciples are doing something that is not lawful to do on the Sabbath. Have you ever noticed when you're reading in the Old Testament, and it talks about priests, talks about Levites, it talks about scribes. It does talk about scribes. You can see the title scribe in Ezra, but you never see the word Pharisee or Sadducee in the Old Testament, right? So this is a group, the Pharisees, I think we're left to assume that in that 400 silent years between Malachi and Jesus beginning his ministry, we're left to assume that is when we had this rise of this Pharisaical sect, right? Never numbered more than about 6,000 people. That's what I've found out in my research, right? 6,000 people, and they were very strict lawyers, right? They were very strict interpreters of the law. And they began to lay down the law, right?
Especially their laws.
Well, and that's exactly what it was, right? So they would take the law, like if you read all the way through, Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, all of those things, and read all of the law, there's 600 laws in there, right? And the Pharisees began to, as they began to look at that, they began to look at each law and to break it down into its component parts, and they created more laws, right? They added on to it. They had 64 volumes, 64 chapters just on the Sabbath alone, right? They began to make laws. So if you are not to do work, right, you're not to do work on the Sabbath, well, they had to define what is work, right? So that's kind of what they did, and they would begin to do, I made a list of things that they did. For example, let's see, the Sabbath, number one, they defined when the Sabbath was, right? They defined when the Sabbath, what defined the Sabbath? What was that length of time? And so you shouldn't, so it's sundown on Friday until you could see at least 3 stars in the sky on Saturday night. So you had to be able to see, so sundown till you could see at least 3 stars in the sky on Saturday night. That was the Sabbath day, right? So if you ever heard the term a Sabbath day's journey? So a Sabbath day's journey is how far you could walk at a very normal pace, right, in that amount of time. From sundown until 3 stars appeared in the sky on Saturday night was about 1,000 yards. That's what they would say, about 1,000 yards, right? So you shouldn't, they had laws like this, that you shouldn't look in a mirror on the Sabbath day. You shouldn't look in the mirror on a Sabbath day, because if you saw a gray hair, you might pluck it out, and if you did that, that's considered reaping. You're reaping a hair off of your head. That's reaping. You could eat an egg. You can eat an egg that was laid on the Sabbath if you killed the chicken that laid the egg, because chicken broke the Sabbath. You remember we said your donkey, your ox, your livestock. So if the chicken laid an egg on the Sabbath, you could eat that egg, but then you had to kill the chicken. But you couldn't kill the chicken until you saw 3 stars in the sky at night, right? Stuff like that, right? So what else? It's kind of interesting. It's kind of funny.
But there were tons of them.
Oh, tons of them. I just scratched the surface, right? So if you had lit your lamp before the sun went down on Friday night, then you couldn't blow them out, right? Because that's work. But if you didn't light your lamp before the sun went down, well, you're out of luck. Now you can't light your lamp until you see 3 stars in the sky the other night. Women or anybody, it was unlawful. Now it was unlawful to wear jewelry because that was carrying a burden. Okay? So they had to define what work was. So they said this is carrying a burden. So they had to define what carrying a burden is. You know what? If you carried anything that weighed more than a dried fig, that's a burden, right?
My labor and delivery nurse just said what happens when a woman goes into labor.
Well, that's a good, I didn't find that, right? I mean, it's a good question. This was the most, just good luck, I get good luck with all that, right? So this was a funny one. You could spit on a rock, right? You could go outside, you could spit on a rock, and that was lawful. But you couldn't spit on dirt because that disturbed the soil, and that was considered plowing. So that is the depth and the legalistic length that they went to define what you could and could not do on the Sabbath. And it's silly. We laugh at it. And it's silly and it's funny and it's all of those things. But they were deadly, deadly serious about all of this. Well, it was indeed. Well, no, yes. Yes and no. I mean, you know, if studying these Pharisees, right, you have such a dichotomy. You know, these people are so dichotomous because, number one, they're very, very, very good people, right? I mean, they did very good things. They taught, you know, they did all of those things, but they're also very, very bad people because they put this yoke on people's shoulders that they couldn't carry, right, Kelvin?
And we have to be careful that our opinion doesn't become a Pharisee law.
That's a true statement.
I mean, sometimes we want to find what we're thinking on others.
You bet.
We may not have any biblical basis.
You bet. Absolutely. Absolutely true. So this is what Jesus was stepping into. I mean, the Sabbath, remember we said, you know, that the Sabbath was given to them, right? For their rest, for their reflection, for their enjoyment, so that they would reflect on God, right? And it was supposed to be an enjoyable thing for them. I mean, I can imagine how enjoyable that should be, how that could be. But if you're given all of these laws, now it has become a burden. And they no longer looked forward to it. They dreaded Shabbat because they couldn't do anything, right? They couldn't do anything on those days. And that is what Jesus was stepping into, right? So let's continue on and let's read starting in verse 3, Matthew chapter 12, verse 3. But he said to them, have you not read what David did when he was hungry, he and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God and ate the showbread, which is not lawful for him to eat, nor those who were with him, but only for the priests? Or have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are blameless, right? So what's he talking about here? What's he talking about with David and the showbread? Well, the showbread was in not the most holy place, but it was in the holy place, right? That's a showbread. That is a remembrance of that manna that God gave to the people when they were out wandering in the wilderness. That's what that was supposed to be for, to remind people, and that was for the priests only. David was on the run from Saul, right? He and his men were being chased by Saul, and Saul was going to kill him. And Ahimelech was the high priest that year, right? And they came into there, and they saw how hungry they were famished, right? And the high priest offered the bread to them. They didn't just take it. The high priest offered the bread to them, and they ate it, right? And they were saved, right? So Jesus is using that example. Notice here that Jesus doesn't deny the fact that his disciples, notice too that Jesus didn't eat the grain. It was his disciples that ate it, and so they were using what his disciples did to trap Jesus, right? But he didn't deny the fact that his disciples had broken the Pharisaical law. He's showing by using this example of David that just like you said, things happen on the Sabbath, right? You know, later on when you read, and this is, if one of you had a lamb that fell into a ditch, into a hole, into a pit, would you not get that lamb out on the Sabbath day? Absolutely. Cows have to be milked. The ox fell into the ditch. Things happen. You have to be able to do some things. You have to eat, right? I mean, excuse me, my voice keeps breaking. You have to be able to feed yourself, you know, all of those things. So he uses that example, and he also uses the other example. What about the priests that are serving in the temple on the Sabbath day? I mean, they're working, right? Are they not breaking those Pharisaical laws because they're working on that day? That's what he's telling them. You are being hypocrites here, you know? And he's telling you can't do that, right? And then he goes on. Look at verse 6. Yet I say to you that in this place there is one greater than the temple. He's talking about himself. But if you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless, for the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. That's a quote from the book Hosea, right? So if we turn back to Hosea chapter 6. Sir, ma'am, where are you? I can't. Okay. compassion.
And not a sacrifice.
Right.
You would not have condemned, you would not have condemned the innocent.
The innocent, right. So mercy, compassion, same thing. So turn over to Hosea, and I think we'll answer that question. Hosea chapter 6, right? And so it's an interesting use. It's almost proof texting. But so, but Jesus quotes this, right? So it's Hosea chapter 6, verse 6, right? And he says that very thing. For I desire mercy and not sacrifice, and the knowledge of God more than burnt offerings. That word that's used there for mercy actually means devotion. Actually, what he's talking about is devotion to God, right? But in that devotion to God, you're showing compassion, you're showing mercy for other people, you're showing love. That's what he's talking about. I desire love. I desire compassion. I desire you to love one another as I love you. That's what he's saying to these people. That's what this is really about, that you have missed the point of the Sabbath day, right? I desire mercy rather more than sacrifice, and I the knowledge of God more than burnt offerings.
He really drives that home in Luke with the crippled woman.
Start over, I'm sorry.
In Luke with the crippled
Yeah.
woman. And he heals her on the Sabbath, and they jump all over him, and he calls them hypocrites, and really drives that point home.
He absolutely does, right? And so if you keep going in this Matthew, the very next section is they go into the synagogue, right, of that town. And it's interesting, it goes into this is your synagogue, rather than saying synagogue, to come. And he heals a man with a withered hand on the Sabbath day, and they try to trap him there too. But I don't want to get into that today, because I wanted to get into this a little more, into this part of Matthew. But so the two things there in Matthew, that he says he desires mercy more than sacrifice and knowledge of God more than burnt offerings. He wants us to know him, right? Not just knowledge, right? Because I'm really bad about getting into just knowledge rather than applying that knowledge and loving one another. I admit that I'm really bad about that. I think I'm starting to get a little bit better. But, he's talking about mercy. He's talking about love. That's what he's talking about here to these Pharisees. If go back to Matthew now, and notice too that he says, after he says that, for the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath, right? So what does that mean? The Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. He's trying to talk to them about something very specific here. What's he trying to say? You got your emphasis on the wrong thing. Where should that emphasis be? It should be on him. It needs to be on Jesus. The emphasis needs to be on Jesus. Because if you believe, and I do, what it says in John, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, then Jesus wrote that commandment, right? He wrote that commandment, right? And he is Lord of that commandment. And he's trying to reiterate the simple fact that this Sabbath is supposed to be for the people, right? Not the people for the Sabbath, which is what the Pharisees had begun to do, right? Any other comments about this before we wrap it up, about the Sabbath, about the Sabbath day, what it was meant to be, what it actually was and is to rabbinical Jews today, right? The Sabbath day is still the same thing. I mean, for example, we talk about how the Pharisees, for power and all, and how they could. I mean, they're the one. All of the things that they wrote down, that the Pharisees wrote down, all the records that they kept, and all the things that when the temple was destroyed, in AD 70, and that post-temple rabbinical Judaism, which is practiced today, stems all the way back to that, to what the Pharisees wrote down. So, it's easy to jump all over them, and rightly so, right? Because they got it wrong. But anyway, any other comments about that before we wrap it up this morning? So what, right? So, you know how I'm trying to do that. Okay, Pat, so what? How does this apply to us today, right? So here's the question. Is Sunday a Sabbath day? Is Sunday Shabbat? I say no. No, it is not. It doesn't meet, for one thing, it doesn't meet the first requirement for it to be the Sabbath day, which is it's not the seventh day, right? It ain't the seventh day, it's the first day. So why do we meet on Sundays? To worship together. You know, we call Sunday the Lord's Day. And I got to tell you, I have to be honest with you, I really don't like that anymore. Because every day is the Lord's Day, right? You should worship God in spirit and truth every single day of our lives, glorify God. But what do we do? Why do we come together on Sunday? Why do we gather together as the church Sunday morning? Why Sunday morning? Not to do all of those things, right? The 5 acts of worship. I agree with you in all of those things. But why Sunday morning? Bus? Yeah, example, right? Well, if you followed exactly what, like if you go into Acts chapter 2, right? If you go into Acts, what does it say? What after 3,000 were added to their number that day, what does it say? They continued in the apostles' fellowship, meeting daily, worshiping God and breaking bread together. Meeting daily. They met every day. I would love to do that, meet every day. I mean, but I come up here on Sunday morning because if I came up here on Thursday, you could meet any day, couldn't you? You could meet, but if I came up here on Thursday, the door would be locked, right? Or if the door weren't locked, I'd be all by myself in here, and what good would that be?
Get into the discussion of whether that breaking bread was a Lord's Supper or...
Well, that's a different subject, right? I mean, I would love for Cam Larry to be here because I would love to have that. That's a different subject, and we can get into that. I would love to get into that as a study, but Sunday morning, the first day of the week, is the day that Jesus was raised from the dead, right? So that, I believe, is the reason why we meet Sunday morning. And the elders have said, the doors are open Sunday morning. Let's all gather together and worship God and do all of those things. So that is what, so Sunday is not the Sabbath day. And so should Christians should followers of Jesus officially observe a Sabbath day, a Shabbat, to God?
Well, you hit it a while ago when you said every day.
There it is. That's it, right? It's like what it's like what we say all the time, right? It's a heart thing, right? It's a heart thing. Any other questions, comments this morning? I hope this has been good. I hope y'all have all enjoyed that. So anyway, that's a look at the Sabbath day, how it began, how it evolved, how it, as usual, when mankind gets involved, it gets messed up. Thank you all very much.